Good morning or good evening, left-handers. This is Sarepti, aka Craig, on my solo podcast here. And for those of you who know me well, or just well enough, know that I am working in conjunction with members of Acid Horizon and the artist Penkeeper, also known as Noah Trapolino, to finish this Kickstarter campaign for Acephalus, the erotic tarot of George Bataille, and a compendium of essays that goes with it. By the time this podcast hits the feed, it's probably the case that there's 3 or 4 days left in the campaign. Please check the link, see where we're at. Get us to the finish line. On the day that this drops, it's probably also the case that people are also dropping their donations at that time. You'll see everything pile up right at the end. Why don't you be part of the deluge? Go ahead and support independent radical publishing, navigate to the Kickstarter link, and help us out. Okay, let's get on to today's episode with Tom Cheetham, talking about Henry Corbin, James Hillman, Carl Jung, dreams, and a substance called Iboga. This is Left Hand. This is Left Hand, and I am your host, Sarepti, aka Craig, from the Acid Horizon podcast. Today, I have the privilege of hosting Tom Cheetham, a scholar whose life's work bridges the worlds of biology, philosophy, and the poetic imagination. From a philosophical foundation influenced by a variety of thinkers, Tom has traversed a remarkable intellectual journey, from systematic entomology and adaptive computation to the profound depths of Henry Corbin's spiritual philosophy. Tom is the author of several acclaimed works exploring Corbin's vision, the imaginal realm, and the unity of religious traditions. His scholarship also embraces the thought of James Hillman, the depth psychology of Carl Jung, and the essential role of art and imagination in shaping our human experience. Today, we'll center our conversation on Tom's enduring engagement with Corbin's work, particularly Corbin's theology of the imagination, and the claim that all the world is an icon. So here we are today to explore how Corbin's vision reshapes our understanding of the sacred, the self, and the world around us. And so without further ado, let me introduce Tom. How are you doing today? And thank you for joining us.
I am quite well. Thanks for having me. I enjoy doing this kind of thing. It's fun.
Well, you have an extensive biography on your webpage, but I was hoping that you could offer your own introduction before we get started today.
Yeah, to do it quickly, because it's not unimportant to you need to know who's talking to you in order to get a sense of which part of the cosmos they're aware of, So it really does matter what people's context is. And as an undergraduate, I was a philosophy major. And then I failed twice to be a graduate student in philosophy and spent 10 years out of the academic world. And when I went back, I went back in the natural sciences. I thought I was going to be a physicist, and for various reasons decided in the end not, and I ended up in biology. But if you were a peculiar enough person to do an undergraduate degree in philosophy, those psychic wounds never leave, and so you're always in some sense a philosopher. So my engagement with the sciences. And I taught, I taught at a small college in Pennsylvania for 10 years as a biologist. But and this is pertinent too, because it helps explain the Hillman interest. We were back in the 80s, one of the reasonably early colleges to set up a program in environmental studies. And it was pretty clear to me that any environmental studies program should span the humanities and the sciences. So being at a very small college, I got to make up the curriculum, and so I taught environmental studies, both from the humanities point of view and the sciences point of view. So I always had a very broad cross-disciplinary take on what ecology was. And in I can date it exactly. It was the summer of 1990. I was in Santa Fe, New Mexico, doing complex systems theory, not more of an observer than as a real creative participant. Stu Kaufman, who was a big deal in that realm, took a liking to me and invited me out to the Santa Fe Institute Complex Systems, the first summer school, which was just absolutely astonishing. And I met people who really were good at these higher realms of theoretical biology, among other things, but the physics, natural science, computer science, all that sort of stuff. I was really into that, and I might well have gone in that direction, except I was in a bookstore in Santa Fe and I saw a copy of Tom Moore's volume, A Blue Fire, which I think is probably still in print. And it's a collection of Hillman's writings. And the title struck me, and I had no idea what I was picking up. And when I got back to Pennsylvania a few weeks later, I opened the book and was just instantly transfixed. And I thought, this is what I've been looking for all my life. It was clear to me in the moment that I understood it not very well. It was clear to me that what he was proposing by putting the imagination at the center of everything was the bridge I needed to connect the sciences and the humanities. And that intuition has stayed with me ever since. And so even when I was in the far reaches of Corbin's mystical theology, I've got a pretty strong a pretty strong background in and abiding interest in natural science and in the natural world. And I've always, I mean, that either makes you insane and entirely schizoid, or it provides a really strong motivation not to keep those two, those, what was C.P. Snow called it, the two cultures long, long ago, science and the humanities, not to keep those entirely apart. And of course, one of the things, and we were talking about contemporary continental philosophy before we started this, it does seem to me that back in my day, the separation between the various disciplines in university was pretty extreme, and I'm very well aware of the fact that it still is many places. But it's also, there's lots of the best, most creative thinkers are trying very hard not to maintain those schisms. And from my point of view, between scientific kinds of imagining and poetic kinds of imagining. I mean, the worst case scenario is, and you can find examples of this to the present day. What's his name? Steven Pinker at Harvard got himself into all sorts of trouble by saying that music. What did he say? Music was like a cheesecake for the mind. And taken at face value, he's writing off, half of human experience and saying, no, really, the only thing that's important is reason and logic and science. And whether he meant to say that, I don't know, but people read him that way. And that's not sustainable. And so what's the other option? Well, you've got to see that reason and rationality, as we have come to understand it in the West, is a subset of something bigger. And that there have to be connections among all the various branches of human endeavor, if you want to put it that way. And I'm happy to say that I still think that a metaphor, something like the imagination, is a very good place to start. in order to have a chance of understanding human in relationship to reality as a whole. And so, since just to finish the bio, I mean, that's the heart of it. Is this back and forth between the sciences and the humanities, and Corbin and Hillman and all the things that came after my engagement with Hillman. Eventually, I came back around and addressed questions of the nature of other kinds of knowledge as well. So that puts a little bit of context to how I think about these things.
Sure. I guess you've answered half of the question I was going to ask you as a follow up to your bio. At the time that you encountered Hillman's work, or maybe even Corbin's work, was there a specific problematic or maybe even an area of your life or a little bit of both that you thought that the work itself really spoke to? I mean, you're coming out of
Oh, yeah.
the discipline of biology. What was it about that work specifically that grabbed you?
I mean, yeah, I've told this story a number of times in a number of different ways, and let's see, what's a good way to frame it. I mean, I could be blunt about it. I was 38 years old in 1990. And I was encountering what Jung would have called my midlife crisis. And it came to me. In the early 90s, I went and saw my first Jungian analyst, and so here's another way for me personally to frame the arc of my life, which is overstating its coherence. But in the first chunk of my life, I was kind of overly intellectual and rational. I liked philosophy and I liked science, and that's all intellect. And that's, Jung will tell you, it's not going to cut it if that's all you've got. And I found that out. And as Jung and Freud would say, at a certain point, the unlived life will reach up and grab you. And I started to get a little bit crazy about the time I started to read Hillman, and I recognized, Jungians might understand my problems. And so I went to see a Jungian analyst who said, "Oh yes, we see these things all the time." That is to say, the uprush of unconscious contents and all that. There really is not a great distinction, though people pretend that there is, between your intellectual work and your personal life. If there's too big a gap, there's bad things will happen. In my case, there wasn't much gap, and so the transition to Hillman. I didn't see Corbin coming, but we'll talk about that in just a sec. But the transition to Hillman was a natural because I was at a point of high psychic stress. And what Hillman clearly was suggesting was a much bigger world than the one of the kind of intellectual entrapment in which I'd situated myself. Okay, I mean, I have nothing but wonderful things to say about philosophy and science and all that, but they occur inside a human life which is much bigger than either the sciences or philosophy. And if you realize that, then your science gets bigger, your philosophy gets bigger, and with any luck, your life gets better. So Hillman was giving me what I needed at that moment in my life, which was, I mean, this is a little overstated, but it was a way out of the sciences and actually, in a funny way, out of the kind of philosophy that I had been trained in, a way out of them in which I didn't have to give them up. I could just recontextualize them. Did I understand this all when I read Hillman for the first time? No, I didn't understand any of it. But over the decades, I've begun to see that that's what he offered me. He offered me a bigger place, a much bigger cosmology, a much bigger place to stand, and to bring my biology and my philosophy along with me. And so that's pretty great, you know. The point is where did Corbin come from? I mean, that I presume is part of your question, and that I didn't see coming either. I read Hillman with tremendous enthusiasm for, I'm not quite sure, but a couple of years, and then I chanced upon his essay, "The Thought of the Heart," and on the first page of that, he says basically, "Oh, if you want to know about the imagination, I've got your guy." And he starts talking about Henry Corbin in terms that are really just, it was astonishing. And I thought, who the hell is this? And this is back in the early '90s. There's little or no internet. And so Henri Corbin, and I looked him up. I don't even remember how, but we used to be able to do things before the internet. And I looked him up, and one of his big books was the book on Ibn Arabi, Creative Imagination and the Sufism of Ibn Arabi. And I thought, well, I mean, I am nuts about Hillman. He is my current hero. And if he thinks that if Corbin is his hero, which on the basis of that essay was pretty much true, Corbin and Jung were big deals for Hillman. I thought, I got to know about this guy. I mean, I already knew a bit about Jung because that came with the territory of doing Hillman. So I grabbed Corbin's book, and that's a more complicated story right from the beginning, because I started to read it, and on the very first page, he makes references to contemporary phenomenology. Okay. And all right, well, I know that. I know Heidegger and Husserl and Merleau-Ponty. I know these people, so that's interesting. And but then you turn the page, and pretty soon it's like it's the Bible and Quran and the angels. And wait a minute, what the heck is going? I don't do that. I'm a scientist, and I was trained in real philosophy, and we do not talk to the people in religion departments because they're all crazy, you know? I mean, it's just, we don't do that. And which of course is wildly wrong. For instance, Heidegger, who I was a big fan of for many years, that was a mistake, but I was. Nobody told us back in 1970 that he'd written his habilitation schrift on Duns Scotus. I mean, he was a master of medieval theology and philosophy. If you knew anything about Western philosophy, it was theology until quite late. But they didn't tell us that. So we were securely embedded in modern times reading phenomenology. And so, what am I to do with the fact that Hillman's enthusiastic about Corbin? Well, stick with it for a while. And my relationship to, which I did, in actual fact, I couldn't put it down. I'd put it down and then pick it up and put it down and pick it up, because Corbin's work had a very strong effect on me, both positive and negative. That book, and this is not true of all his writing, but that's a beautiful book. I mean, his writing, he could write better, that's for sure. But if you just let it happen to you, that's an absolutely astonishing book, full of mystery and wonder, except it's couched in the language of mystical medieval theology, both Islamic and Christian. And that was a very, very heavy lift for me. And it took me, I don't know, many years of ambivalence. And this is our sort of interesting to try to articulate all these years later. I knew somehow I needed to be able to move into his world. And one way to put it, it's a little, it's a little glib, but it works for me. where was he standing in order to say these things? He clearly knew Heidegger and contemporary philosophy. And actually, a few years into reading Corbin, I discovered he was the first Frenchman to translate Heidegger. He knew Heidegger personally. He went to visit him after The Being in Time came out. And he was the first person. Yeah, it's like, oh no, what the hell? And at the same time, he's a scholar of Persian mysticism. And he clearly knows the entire Western philosophical tradition. He wrote articles on Kierkegaard and Karl Barth, and he translated Heidegger. And at the same time, he's mostly known as a scholar and proponent of medieval Shiite mysticism. And I was just completely confounded about how such a human being could possibly exist. And I wanted to know how he did this, and what does where is your where are you in reality when those are the things that speak to you most directly? You know, his some people have heard this because I find it utterly entrancing. It is true, and I know this for a fact because I have a friend who's seen the volume. Corbin's German copy of Being in Time, which he read when it first came out in 1929, is glossed in the margins in Persian and Arabic. What the heck? So, I mean, what? I mean, that's bizarre and intriguing and strange. And so he's translating Shuravardi from the medieval Persian and Arabic at the same time that he's reading Being in Time, and he's thinking, look at this. This is great. These guys, I can put them together. And of course, he was the only person in the universe, at least my known universe, who was doing such a thing. And that suggests as Charles Olson would say, a stance towards reality, which was unique and super intriguing.
So, do you think there's ways in which his work with Heidegger colors his view of Islamic mysticism and vice versa?
Yeah, you bet. So Corbin's a funny figure. I mean, speaking as an objective historian, he's a kind of an odd figure. He's not alone. Many of the people who were the leading lights at the Eranos conferences in Switzerland were near unique or unique in Corbin's sense, because he looks to many as if he were a scholar, and he was, but he was also a creative philosopher and theologian. So in the same sense that you don't read Heidegger in order to become an expert on the pre-Socratics, because he's Heidegger and he gets to do whatever he wants with the pre-Socratics, and so many of his colleagues would take umbrage at his interpretations and his commentaries, and they'd say, "Well, this isn't objectively true," without overstating it, because he was a superb scholar. His mission was not only to be a scholar and a translator and a commentator on these ancient texts. He wanted to use them as a human being, as a seeker after truth. So in the same sense that Heidegger can do what he feels like with Parmenides and get away with it, Corbin does the same with Ibn Arabi. And Ibn Arabi scholars will say, yeah, you've got to be careful. You don't read Corbin in order to find out what Ibn Arabi said. You're reading Corbin to find out what Corbin says Ibn Arabi said. And that's a very different thing. If you want to read If you want to know as objectively as possible what Ibn Arabi or Mullah Sadr or Shiravardi said, then you go to other scholars, people who make it their business to be scholarly, historically minded, absolutely accurate in terms of the etymologies and the linguistics. But Corbin has his own project, and and this is one of the things that makes him both exciting and maddening, because in the same book or same paragraph as he talks about Shiravardi, he'll throw in, Swedenborg or Heidegger or people who come from wildly different cultures and wildly different backgrounds and speak different languages. And he says, well, let's take a look at how these things might fit together in this context that he himself is trying to articulate. So to ask whether Heidegger colored his reading of the Shiites and Shiites the reading of Heidegger, that was all colored in Corbin's peculiar creative process.
One of the reasons that I went deeper into Corbin's work is just the concept and the term active imagination. And I learned from you that it's actually, Corbin actually takes that term from Carl Jung, but kind of puts his own twist on it. So when we read active imagination in Jung, and then we read active imagination in Corbin, we're actually reading about slightly divergent things. And then that term then appears in Hillman's work. For Hillman, both Jung and Corbin are mediators. So I was hoping you could give us a sort of genealogy of this term within the scope of the figures that we're looking at. What does it mean? What does it do? What does it do for Corbin? And what does it do in Hillman and so forth?
Yeah, no, it's super interesting. And I mean, I've been soaking in this stuff for a really long time, which is both, which makes it, in the long run, it makes it difficult to talk about because it's easier when it's simpler, and the more you know about it, the more nuances it gets. But I can cut to the chase here, which is, I mean, chronologically, Jung comes first. We can say that. There's probably somebody else who used the term active imagination before Jung did, but let's just keep him as the first person to use it, at least in this context. And for him, and the caveat here is that while I make some, there's some truth to my being a bit of a scholar of Corbin. I am not a scholar of Jung, so bear with me here. But this is my reading of Jung. He did his Red Book as a result. He was sort of driven to doing his Red Book as a result of his own psychic breakdown, if you want. It depends on how you want to contextualize it. And because he was intuiting that the only one of the best ways to not lose it completely and be able to keep practicing and being a husband and father was to engage with these figures that were just erupting into his consciousness, and to engage with them as if they were real, which is brilliant, courageous. I mean, really bold. The older I get and the more experience I have with upheavals of the psyche, the more respect I have for Jung's life's work. I mean, man, he was among the first in modern times to wrestle with the full blown power of what we now tend to call the psyche. And as he says, the encounter with the living God is, well, I can't remember, but he said, it's not fun. you know? And so, I mean, one of the things about Jung is he's not just a person. He's a doctor, and he's a practicing clinician whose patients are mostly psychotics. So when he himself starts to develop these irrepressible images and urges and psychic upheavals, he's got his psychotic patients in the back of his mind, and he thinks, I don't want to do that. Thank you very much. So I'm going to head into this with my ego and my morality, but I'm going to treat these figures as if they were persons and talk to them. And, so that goes on and on and on. Anybody who knows anything about Jung knows about this. But then he comes up with the term active imagination. I mean, so that both expresses what he thought was going on, and it also kind of diffuses it in a way that can be quite useful. It means that you can engage in active imagination even if you're not near psychotic. That is, you can do it, and if you accept that that he's named something which is a fundamental capacity of the human being, which is to creatively imagine, yeah, in such a way that it's not always clear which stuff you're making up on your side and which stuff is being discovered, right? Because active imagination is one frame for what Corbin and others call creative imagination. And in my my experiences have changed just recently, but the one that I usually default to is pretty simple. If you're any kind of artist or poet, or if you engage in any of the arts, music, any of the arts, literature, and I use poetry as an example because it's one of the first things I purposively engaged in as the technique of active imagination, because I was in Jungian analysis, and they said, you should try this. Well, one of the things you may notice if you engage in the arts and you're at all successful in it, in the sense, I don't mean that you get published and people love your work, just that you seem on your own to be tapping into something and you think, ooh, this is good. This is good. There are moments in that kind of artistic process where you're not you're on the boundary between creation and discovery. You sit down to write a poem, that's you creating something, but then you get to the third word and balloon, that's the word. And was that, did I do that, or did I not do that? And this being in that funny place where you don't know if it's creation or if it's discovery, that's where active imagination is doing its work. And it's that intermediary place that Jung was suggesting was where certain kinds of therapy had their center, because at that point you're engaging with material which is, if you want to call it this, unconscious.
One of the things that Hillman does with it, the imagination for him, is this space between the region of the soul and the spirit. And it's this sort of negotiating, like a liminal space or an intermediary space of sorts, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. And Corbin sees it as this sort of reified entity of sorts when we're talking about the active imagination.
That's not wrong. And the question is, what are these three? What are the differences among these three? And I think, it's very clear that Corbin is a bit of an outlier here, but I think that Hillman and Jung have significant differences, which are really interesting and important. And what's a good way to talk about this? One of the reasons I'm hesitating so much is that this material is forever alive for me, and I've just come back from some very intense and interesting experiences, which are probably changing my interpretation of the nature of the imagination, and also therefore my perspective on what I understand Jung and Hillman to be doing. And right here in the moment, I'm seeing Hillman and Jung being kind of on the same page in terms of active imagination in the following way. Let me distinguish them, however, in this way. Jung was, I believe, always a bit ambivalent about how he wanted to market Jungian psychology because he had the experiences himself, the whole Red Book thing, for years. He was deeply in the world of the active creative imagination. You might even say the mundus imaginalis of Corbin. And so he knew what he was talking about. And this is the Gnostic Jung. And this is the Jung who, when asked, "Do you believe in God?" said, "I don't believe, I know he exists." But that Jung inhabits the same psyche as the guy who insists that he's a psychologist and he can't make any ontological claims about God. And he's never quite able to put those two together because, Jesus, how could you? He decides not to become a prophet. He decides that he's a psychologist, and yet there's the part of him that had these transformative experiences, which were individual and individuating, and how do you market that? Well, in the end, he doesn't market it as a religion or a spiritual path, though he's close to it, as many people who read him for that reason, because he seems to give, sort of scientific bona fides to a spiritual path. But he ends up marketing it as psychology. And that's a problem. And you see the results of it today is that you can't study Jung in any major university in most places in the world. There's cracks in that here and there now. And that's part of that earlier story we were saying about the breakdown of but it's okay to be a Freudian, kind of, depending on which department you're in. But Jung, no. And why is that? Well, I mean, you could say, there's a whole slew of, accusations that he was anti-Semitic, and I don't really even have an opinion about that. I don't think he was, but probably he was a little bit. A lot of people were. But the main problem with Jung is all this mystical stuff that people just don't want to touch, and the whole alchemical business. And then, wrote a book on UFOs. I mean, nobody wants to touch this stuff in genuine academia. So if he really wanted to market it as psychology, he would have done what Freud was able to do, is to say, God's an illusion, and the rest of it's all sex. And that sells. People in Harvard will buy that, because it's nice and clean and reductionist, and it fits with the rest of the Enlightenment paradigm. But Jung, and there are other readings of Freud, of course, but that's the version of Freud that had academic success by and large, at least in the beginning. But Jung couldn't do it. He just said, no, because look at the experiences I've had. I know, yeah. And so what do you end up with? And here's where you make the transition to Hillman. What you end up with in Jung is that, in my opinion, and that's my opinion, his best stuff is the alchemical stuff. Well, oh man, that's a heavy lift. If you're going to, I would like to teach Jung in a college. No, man, it's nuts. No, you can't do that. You can teach Freud. That's fine because he says God doesn't exist, but you can't do alchemy. We do not do alchemy. And Jung had that conflict between the Gnostic and the mystic and the scientist, and it was embedded in him personally. Hillman doesn't have that. And so, at least in my reading of Hillman, there's plenty of things that give Hillman's work tensions and conflicts and all the other stuff, but he doesn't give a damn about science. He's not worried about pissing off other the rat psychology department. He's not worried about them. He's not worried about the chemists. He's not worried. He's just an archetypal psychologist working on the fringes of Jung's psychology, and here's another thing, which is sort of it sort of links and also separates them. The Jung that I love kind of wished he was back in the Middle Ages or at least early modernity, so he'd have alchemists to talk to. and and Hillman, the more his work develops, my sense is that he abandons more and more the viewpoint of contemporary psychology, and he wishes he lived in the Italian Renaissance so he could hang out with Marsilio Ficino and Giambattista Vico, and his cosmology and the world that he was trying to bring back to life is essentially Neoplatonic, you know, and he doesn't have the the particular conflict between science and whatever this stuff is that Jung had. So that's a long-winded, but I think generally accurate comparison of the two of them. And if you'll bear with me for another couple of minutes, I'll talk about Corbin, because if you think of Jung and Hillman on that kind of continuum and that kind of comparison, then that provides a kind of nice context for how to think about their differences with regard to active imagination. And in the moment here, I'm thinking they share more, far more than distinguishes them. I'd have to think about it some more now because I haven't thought about that explicitly in a long time. Except to say that Hillman kind of takes it to the extreme. Hillman's whole therapeutic endeavor is pretty much based on active imagination and an extension, not a denial, but an extension, and if anything, an amplification of Jung's sense that you need to behave towards these images as if they were real. And Hillman ramps that up, you know? He really ramps that up and makes it very close to the entirety. Oh, here's another. Yeah. I mean, all three of these thinkers are huge, complicated, full of contradictions, so there's an infinite number of things to say about them. And what we think we know about Jung is Jungian psychology. And nowadays, and it's to be found in Jung, but nowadays it has become a kind of interpretive juggernaut, and so you learn all the techniques of Jungian psychology, and you learn all the archetypes, and and there's a whole paraphernalia, a whole armamentarium of terms and ideas, and I'm not sure that Jung would be all that happy with being taken so literally. And nonetheless, maybe the major difference between Jungian psychology and what Hillman does is that Hillman is the madman. Hillman is extremely allergic to any vestiges of what Jung called the monotheism of consciousness. And Jung was against it too. There are all sorts of places to read Jung, and he's not entirely consistent, which is the mark of a great creative mind. So one of the things that Hillman loves about Jung is the idea of multiple centers of consciousness. The ego is not alone in there. And Hillman loves that. I mean, he's Mr. Greek pantheon. He's the polytheist in counter to what you could sometimes genuinely say is the monotheism of Jung. But in Jung, you'll find polytheism too, So Hillman takes parts of Jung and ports them out and says, we're going to leave. For instance, Hillman doesn't like the idea of strengthening the ego, or he's allergic to the notion of the unified self. And, where Jung some of the time, much of the time, and most Jungians are interested in, the balanced ego and to bring the shadow into consciousness, and so you develop some sort of wholeness. And then on a certain day, I can get very enthusiastic about that. And you don't find any of that in Hillman. He's not interested. He's not interested in wholeness. And what I used to say, and it's true, and it's a nice little quip, is that when I was undergoing lots of psychological stress many times in my life, when I was feeling threatened with dissolution, I would read Jung. And when I was feeling trapped, I would read Hillman.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I know Hillman kind of is a pariah to some in that community because some see him as committing an act of apostasy against Jung's ideas.
Absolutely. Well, that's obvious where I stand, which is to say that there's enormous things that are of great value in Jungian psychology, but where, in my experience, some Jungian psychologists, though not all, fall short is that they take it too literally and too rigidly. And I mean, and you can find critiques of his own psychology in Jung himself. He says, I know all this stuff, but when I sit down in front of an individual human being, I try to forget every bit of it. You've got it if you need it, and there aren't a lot of Jungs around. And if you're just a person who's interested in Jungian psychology, it's kind of reassuring to have all those textbooks that tell you what to do. And Jung didn't have those. And anyway, so one of the main differences between Jung writ large and Hillman is that Hillman has no patience with unification, and that's why he's so fond of the Greek gods, and why he's very skeptical that unifying the ego is a useful therapeutic tool. I mean, and then I'm not a therapist, but it's pretty clear to me that in my own life there were times when I damn well needed some unification. And Hillman, as a therapist, I'm sure was sensitive to that. I've known people who knew him and worked with him, and he was brilliant as a therapist, and exquisitely sensitive to the moment. But he wasn't trying to unify the personality. He didn't have a goal in the way in which many Jungians, following on Jung's own system, had a goal. So anyway, so that's one of the things that distinguishes them. But then, with regard to active imagination, and maybe this got cut, maybe it didn't. The notion of sticking with the image and treating the images as actually real, that's very, very central to Hillman's practice and his theory. He says, if you get a snake, it's a snake. And he's very allergic to interpretation from the outside. You can do interpretation from the inside, but the kind of, and this struck me early because I was teaching biology and natural science at the same time I was reading Hillman. I thought, oh, well, this is a natural history of the psyche. Hillman says, you get a snake, you get an insect, look at it, describe it, talk about it, and talk to it. So you get a little farther than you can out in the field. But I thought, oh, this is very ecological. His approach, Jung's got there's a lot of metaphors that work for Jung, but one of the nice ones for Hillman is ecology. He's a very ecological kind of psychologist. He's wildly enthusiastic and excited about the particular image that you got and what can happen to it as you begin to work with it. So for Hillman, active imagination, and here maybe I got the idea this way, though it never occurred to me before. Science is a kind of active imagination. Now, careful. It's when you think about the images that occur in Jung's writing, and in Hillman's writing, and you look at the way they talk about them and use them and explore them. And then in the afternoon, you're doing microbiology or invertebrate zoo, and you're looking at things, and you remember that Jung says you are always in psyche. So when you're looking at a garden snail on the lab bench, that's an image. And you slowly begin to realize that, oh, everything's imagination. And that's exactly what Hillman says. And I will segue to Corbin in just a second, because that's a very different kettle of fish. But one of the most important things that I got out of Hillman, um, it took me a long time because it requires a complete alteration in the cosmology of a modern reductionist materialist. Hillman says that the main problem that we face is literalism. Okay, because we take the ego as literal. And he says, has anyone ever seen an ego? And you think, oh, well, that's funny. No one's ever seen an ego. But particularly in the English language, everything becomes a noun. And as soon as it's a noun, it's a thing, and it becomes literalized. And then you begin to think, oh, well, that's what science generally does, is it explores, and then it gets the truth, and it gets a fact, and the fact is literal. Well, right. Okay. And I spent, most of my life living that way. And then Hillman says, stunningly, even literalizing is a mode of imagining. And the first time I read that, I thought, uh-oh. Holy shit. That's like, I intuited that was the whole game right there. But it took me a very long time, and I mean maybe a decade, to work myself into such a state that I could begin to recognize that, holy shit, I think he's right. At which point your entire cosmology has to shatter and reassemble itself. And yeah, and so that was his primary gift to me, to see that even literalizing is a mode of imagining. Whoa. And so, I mean, one of the things that happens to that is the centrality of the human person kind of dissolves. And that brings us to Corbin. Okay. Because this is a long journey for me, through Jung and Hillman and then through Corbin, to get to where I am now. And it was a journey from literalisms, some of them reductive materialist and some not, but literalisms. You study philosophy in order to get the truth. At least that's what I was doing. And then among the people that I read was Richard Rorty, who really flipped me out. About the same time I discovered Hillman, Rorty says, oh, yeah, well, philosophy is a form of literature invented by Plato. Uh-oh. It's like, oh, man, that's intense. And it was that same summer that I discovered Hillman's book. And I thought, wow, what could that possibly, oh, man. you know, Wow. Okay. Hillman calls it the poetic basis of mind. And the sciences then are part of that. And literalizing is one form of imagining. Hillman would immediately point out that you can't avoid literalizing. Otherwise, you can't make your coffee in the morning. I mean, you must literalize something. But if you were to move to Saigon, or if you were to translocate to the high mountains of Colombia and insert yourself in a radically different culture, you would find that there were things that they were literalizing that you don't. And that would be very dissociating until you started to think, okay, I begin to reorganize myself. It doesn't mean that if the Arawak tribesman hits you with a rock, you don't die. That's a useful overlap, you know. But it doesn't mean that it was the same rock for both of you. And this gets complicated really fast. But if you take this seriously, it makes reality shimmer a little bit for you and makes you a little more humble and a little less certain of your own certainties. Okay.
You know, we were talking about Deleuze a little bit before we started recording, and I know you mentioned that, you know, it might be an uphill battle to take on a new philosopher at this juncture in your journey. But one of the things that you might appreciate about Deleuze is that very early in his career, he identified, well, he has a concept called the image of thought, which I think pairs nicely with Hillman's assessment that everything is an image in some sense, that even when we manifest or we conceive of a philosophy, it's so undergirded by imaginal presuppositions and all kinds of other content that hold down those ideas. And if you act in a milieu of philosophical debate, I mean, there's so many times in which you can see the psychological investments of those holding positions and using them as a readout against some sort of psychological offense, even. I just thought that was like a profound sort of intersection between Hillman and Deleuze's work. But when we start imagining even the act of thinking, of philosophizing, of creating concepts as an act of imagination, then, like you said, it brings not only a sense of humility, but maybe even a touch of compassion as well, because we're all sort of operating within this inchoate soup of the imagination.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, in some other life, I would come back, or better yet, and I could take an out of time moment and read all of Deleuze, and because I think, I mean, because I suspect that there's vast swaths of Deleuze that are directly pertinent to the things I've gotten from these thinkers and a few others, and it's really nice because a lot of people don't follow the Hillman Corbin path, and I think what they're presenting is profoundly important. And so when I see bits of it in more mainstream, I mean, Deleuze mainstream, yeah, sure, no, he is in more mainstream people. I think, oh, this is good. That's great because these folks are all, it's the modern, postmodern. That's a word. It means too many things, but it's the postmodern moment, and I keep coming across uh, people in the humanities and a few in the sciences who share many of these presuppositions about the nature of reality, and it's fun. It just means you've got another language to learn. Okay, but to address our question here about Corbin, who I've said very little about, so I didn't see Corbin coming. I didn't know I was going to spend 30 years of my life thinking about Corbin. And honestly, for the last 10 or 12 years, I keep telling myself, no more. I'm never going to talk about Corbin again. No, that's never going to happen because he's deep under my skin and people like to hear me talk about him. Why is he important? In our context here, where we've got Jung, who's sort of ambivalent about whether he's a prophet or a scientist, and he comes down on the side of being a very interesting science because why? Because he had a practice, he had a job, he had a therapeutic practice, you know and he couldn't start a church. He'd lose all his clients, So because of and Hillman too, although late in his life he kind of gave up the practice, but he always had the people to work with. And Corbin is not like that at all. And so for very good, solid reasons, they differ. And and yet it's an interesting kind of progression because for me at least, so you got Jung, who's half mystic and half scientist. You got Hillman, who's allergic to both science and mysticism. We don't have time to talk about that, but he's allergic to both of those things. And then you have Corbin, who who comes into Jung's orbit in 1949 when he's already almost, he's like 49, he's 46 years old. So Corbin is already an established adult scholar with viewpoints and ideas, and he gets invited to Eranos. And because they kicked Louis Massignon out because he was too political, and they needed somebody to cover Islam, and so they invited Corbin, who was a student of Massignon, by the way. And so Corbin comes in, and he finds himself in this Jungian environment. And whether he knew anything of Jung before that, I really honestly don't know. But in the things that he wrote for perhaps the next 10 years, you find scatterings of Jungian terms. And Jung's 20 years older already than Corbin. And so they're two mature thinkers. And I don't think that either was a significant influence on the other. But Corbin saw in some of Jung's ideas, that's what we call X, and because he was at Eranos and giving lectures there, he would use the Jungian terminology. And that's my theory. And I know people who know Corbin better than I do who say, yeah, that's probably right. So he uses active imagination and a number of other Jungian kinds of terms with abandon in his book on Avicenna, and occasionally in the Ibn Arabi book, and maybe in Spiritual Body and Celestial Earth. But then after that, they just disappear. He doesn't really need them if he's not talking to a Jungian audience, And his context is completely different from that. I mean, pretty completely, except that he and Jung and Hillman all have the education in European culture in the early 20th century. And so they all know the literature and the philosophy and the theology. Hillman probably is somewhat less so, but not much less. I mean, because theology is close to psychology, and these are the ideas that we have in the West. But Corbin is a theologian. And genuinely a mystic. I mean, he wasn't like Ibn Arabi kind of mystic, but there's no doubt that he had his own experiences, which he wrote about almost not at all. But he knew what he was talking about, and he knew, as we've already said, he knew the Western theological and philosophical tradition really, really well. But his specialty became Persian mysticism, particularly in the Middle Ages, but more than that. But his overarching project, he modeled, consciously or not, on what Shuravardi, the 12th century Persian mystical theosopher, took as his project, which was to show the Muslims of the 12th century that the native Persian religion, Zoroastrianism, was not inconsistent with Islam, which would be in the Quran, God says, to every peoples we have given a prophet. And then Shuravardi said, well, yeah, we had Zoroaster over here, and let's show how those religions fit together in this lovely way. And Corbin wanted to do the same thing for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And he called this the Harmonia Abrahamica. So he's interested in the unity of the mystical visions of these three religions and Zoroastrianism, which he's very enthusiastic about, at least in its early manifestations. He writes very significantly about Zoroastrianism, and he sees it as his post-Islamic project to show that these religions all really share a common bond, which is, of course, a beautiful thing to try to do. And he never converted to Islam. And so I think of him as a extremely liberal, post-Islamic Protestant, Christian. Post-Islamic because he thinks the doctrine of the incarnation is the worst thing that ever happened to Christianity, which makes him a bit of an outlier as a Christian, you know. But the reason he does that has to do with the active imagination and with Hillman's claim that our worst fault is literalism. And here comes the full-blown theological interpretation of active imagination. And you see why I felt constrained to do the whole thing. Because for Corbin, the active imagination only makes sense theologically. It's not us. Corbin's full-blown cosmology is a cosmology which he adopts in large measure from Ibn Arabi, but he's got other sources too in the West and elsewhere, where, how do you put this easily? Ibn Arabi will say, and Corbin will quote him, that, well, you know, it's complicated, but from one point of view, everything is imagination. And in that point of view, well, it's kind of God's point of view, but nonetheless, it's a point of view because God's up there, and in the magnificent creation story that Corbin uses in that book on Ibn Arabi, God's up there. He's a hidden treasure, and he longs to be known. He's sad. He's up there being God, and he's all alone, and that's a bummer. And so he realizes he needs creatures to praise him and to be with. And so out of his but see, it's a wonderful vision as long as you don't start taking it too literally. If you read it, and I would read Hillman and Jung and Corbin as if it was literature, and then you're in, you know, you just abandon the search for absolute truth. You're not reading these things to know the truth of God. You're trying to change your life. So you read Corbin's account of the creation myth, and God's lonely and sad. And it's out of that sadness that he breathes out this existentiating breath of compassion, and everything appears. But then everything kind of wants to come back. Well, if you think of that, you know, so there's this cycle of descent and ascent, and that's the necessary context to understand what Corbin means by active imagination. Okay, so the whole thing is, in some sense, imagination, but it's God's imagination. And now you come all the way down to us, like 10 levels down, if you're Avicenna. 10 levels down, you hit kind of rock bottom. Not quite, but pretty close, and that's us. And we're creations of the divinity. We're a long way away, but we're creations of divinity, so we've got that imagination in us. We've also got the dark side of us, which is just our own little kind of stinky imagination. You know, it's like, ooh, I wish I had more money. Ooh, I wish I had that woman. Ooh, I wish I could sleep with her. You know, that kind of thing. And Corbin says, yeah, no, that's not, no, that's like, yeah, that's the far side of the imagination. Although God did give it to you, so treat it nicely. But then if you do it right, if you are properly oriented, the imagination that you are able to both create and receive simultaneously, and here we are back again to that notion of that you see in Jung and Hillman of the double-sided nature of imagining. Did I make that up or did it come to me? For Corbin, that's part of this enormous cosmological theology. What you're called to do is face the right way and develop your sensibilities in such a way that you can. Well, in many religions, they talk about discernment. You read the Desert Fathers, you know, and it's like, ooh, is that a demon or an angel? And how am I supposed to tell? I mean, they had their own little versions of the Red Book. You know, it's like, ooh, is that, oh man, I can't tell if that's a demon or an angel, and who's going to tell me? And that's discernment. And that's what spiritual paths are often about. But you see, when Corbin then on the early pages of his book on Ibn Arabi, which were delivered as Erasmus lectures in Switzerland with Jung in attendance, or he died. I think he might have died by then, I'm not sure. But anyway, he had a whole audience of Jungians and Jungian wannabes. And he uses active imagination as a term for this, and creative imagination. But he's over here, and they're over here, and there is absolutely overlap. But if you're a practicing clinician working with disturbed people, active imagination has this whole bunch of other connotations that it doesn't have if you're listening to Corbin. Okay, that's the shortest version I can do.
But one that seems completely exhaustive. And we're already at an hour and 15 minutes. But you've been fantastic. But as we sort of make our way to the finish line here, I wanted to ask you about you. You recently went to Brazil, and I'm active in some online communities where somebody said, oh, you should ask him about his recent experience called the Bwiti discipline. Is that what it is? To be honest, this was the first time that I encountered this. So I'll need a full explanation of what it is that you actually did. And I don't know, maybe there's a way that you can connect it back to Corbin and the things that we're talking about here today.
Oh, yeah. Oh yeah, it does. I mean, in one sense, it's my life, so of course it all connects. And if it doesn't, I'll make it connect just by being here, But it does. And let's see, we don't have a lot of time. This is, of course, a vast topic. So this is a good challenge. Let me see if I can do this. The elevator pitch version. I was never interested in psychedelics when I was a kid. That is, in college, though they were everywhere. I could have had anything I wanted in any amount, but I honestly didn't think I was psychically stable enough, which I wasn't. So I never took any. I've been, I'm older now, and lots of things have happened to me, and and so just a few years ago, I thought, I ought to do that, because that's the thing. I never tried this. This is very interesting. So I grew a few mushrooms, and I ate a lot of them, and then I got Grateful Dead posters, but nothing, nothing transformative. And so I dropped it. I thought, well, I just made me kind of sick, and it didn't transform my life. But then I got an invitation from one of my students to come down to Brazil and to do Iboga. And I thought, I've never heard of Iboga. I know about ayahuasca because I know several people, and one in particular who's quite knowledgeable about it in practice and in theory. And I said to her, I've been invited to go to Brazil to do Iboga. Oh, you shouldn't do that. People die taking Iboga. And I thought, ooh, that sounds good. That sounds like something I want to do. And so I looked into it, and I asked, and my source down there said, oh yeah, you can get in a lot of trouble, but I know this guy. He says, there's two people in the world that I trust with this. Well, in Brazil that I trust with this. And this is one of them. And I've worked with him. And so you'll be safe. It's fine. So I went down, and boy, it's hard to do the short version of this because I find it endlessly interesting, and it was interesting. But I went down really without knowing what I was getting into, and I think that was pretty unconsciously conscious of me, or unconsciously, because I think if I'd known what I was getting into, I wouldn't have done it. I just wanted to go down, take a big, powerful drug to see what happened. And which it is. It's got a reputation, well-deserved, as it turns out, for being a very, what would you say, high octane. It's a very powerful psychic medicine. But I didn't know what I was getting into. And to make it real short, the people that I did my initiation with 3 times now. It's a tradition from West Africa. It's based on the effects of a plant called Tabernantha iboga, which, as far as anyone knows, was first discovered millennia ago as a psychologically active drug by the pygmies in the forest of the Congo Basin. And over the millennia, it's spread into at least Gabon, where the Bwiti cult, and you can call it a religion, it's the Bwiti religion. But of course, Gabon, with its colonial history, all sorts of things have come in. So it's no longer its indigenous form, it's now a syncretistic religion. And so there are elements of Christianity and elements of Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam. So, it's a mix and match in honestly, in a way that's not that shocking to a scholar of Corbin, because Corbin was similarly eclectic. You got Mullah Sadra, and you got Jakob Burma, and you got Swedenborg, and he's perfectly willing to do that. And the Bwiti tradition is kind of like that. The Nima, the shaman that I've worked with, is actually a refugee, as it were, from the French army. He went to Gabon in the French army and fell in love with the people and the culture, and he lived there for 12 or 15 years and became a consecrated priest in the religion. And then he wanted to spread it outside of Gabon, and he asked his masters, and some of them said, "Yeah, I don't think so. We don't want you to spread this to other people." But other masters said, "Oh, absolutely, you should absolutely take it." And so he did. And so the group that I've worked with is Gregory Puente, the Frenchman, and he's the Nima. And there's this magnificent harp. We call him Fiston, and his other name is, I can't pronounce it for you now. But he comes from Gabon for several months a year to be the harpist, which is magnificent. It's just magnificent. And then a bunch of others, Brazilians and French people, who are part of the officiants of the group. And they run the initiations of maybe a dozen people at a time, maybe 15. I could talk about this forever, but I won't. And it's a 4-day ceremony. On the third, I don't know, one night, second night. On the third night, you take some of the plant medicine. And you lie on a mat. And as with Iboga, there's often a lot of vomiting involved. And then if it works out that way, you take the plant on the second night. And then the next morning, you get up and do your final rituals and celebrations, and then you leave. I didn't see any of this coming, and that's another long story. But the take home of the 3 times I have gone is interesting. I went down the first time, and I discovered that I was totally resistant to the whole thing. Oh no, because it's a real ritual. I just wanted to go down and take a drug, you know. you know, and I didn't want the feathers and the bells and the ritual ablutions and all this sort of ridiculous, nonsense ritual. I just wanted the damn drug. So I was very, very resistant. I behaved relatively well. But then when I took the plant that night, I never vomited. I wasn't given too much, and your dosage depends on what the spirits tell them. And thankfully, the spirits said, "Don't give this guy very much." And I had a very dark and ostensibly uninteresting experience, and lost consciousness relatively quickly. And I refused to take it the second night. Long story. And then the morning of the final ceremony, it hit me. And I started to cry. And the take-home message was, I started to feel just a little bit of what I could only call the cosmic feminine. And I could go on and on and on, but I won't. But after 4 days of being negative and bitchy and annoying and never coming down there again, as soon as that Sunday morning happened, I thought, I'm coming back. So I came back within the next year. And to be very short about it, which is hard, I was prepared. I knew what was going to happen. I participated more fully and more enthusiastically, and they gave me 4 spoons of the stuff, and it's very wretched. It's very, very, very wretched. And you get 4 spoons down, and you're going to end up vomiting, which I did. I didn't take any the second night because I was told, "Oh, you don't need it." Because what happened to me was 36 hours of what, until a few weeks ago, I used to say was the worst 36 hours of my life. It was almost entirely unconscious, almost entirely lying on the mat and being worked over in the darkness of the unconscious by this, whatever the plant is. And having a couple of small, I won't do it, I won't go into it now, but having a couple of very small visions, which were nonetheless really significant, and hating every minute of it, and popping out the other end and saying, on Sunday morning after just misery, oh, I have to come back. That was, it's like, I don't know, something just happened to me at a level which, given my vocabulary, I had to call these psycho-cosmological, because it wasn't psychology, I mean, it was somatic and cosmic. Anyway, so I thought, okay, I'm coming back. I just came back from the time number 3. And they always one thing I should say for people listening and contemplating doing such a thing: everybody's experience is different. I don't care what anybody tells you. You can read that there are commonalities, and maybe there are, but ignore that, because everyone's experience is different. And I know many people whose first experience was so fantastically great they came back, and then their second one wasn't. It was really hard. Usually it's fairly hard, but often it also includes sweetness and light and joy and all these great. Not me, not yet. So I went down for the third time, honestly not expecting anything, just going down, man. I got to do this, because that was intense, and this time was exponentially more difficult. And I didn't take anything the second night because I was in no shape to sit up. I was largely unconscious and in the psychological dark the entire time. And how do you put this? You don't put this in a way that makes sense to anyone. But at the apex or nadir of my experience was an infinite number of simultaneous cosmic apocalypses in which all being ever was destroyed, taken into the void and meaninglessness. Which sounds like a thing that might happen, but it wasn't. It was not good, and I was not human. It was very strange. And just at that point, I started to come a little bit back so that there was a human being there. And I thought, oh no, Iboga is not going to work for me. They're going to leave me here. And in that moment, I actually began to return to something like consciousness. And in that moment, I realized, oh my God, that's the darkness I've been running from all of my life. And that's the thing that has kept me ever from being able to fully love.
It's interesting, not to respond autobiographically, but I recently came back from Zurich, and I also went to Sils Maria in Switzerland as well, and visited where Nietzsche had written Thus Spoke Zarathustra and some other works. But I dream a lot. That's one of the reasons that I'm involved with Hillman and such, is because I have a very powerful dream life. And it had been a while since I had a big one, but when I slept at the hotel just adjacent to Nietzsche's old dwelling there, I had one of the most physically powerful dreams of my life. I woke up with my heart beating, and it kind of rhymes with your experience in the sense that I experienced what I simply call the cosmic feminine myself. The dream is pretty simple. I'm at a party. It's in a castle, and all the gods of history are in it with me. And in the adjacent room, as the party's going, I walk over, and there's a woman sleeping, and what lies over her is the material to make a wedding gown. And then the other party goers, there was a feeling of conviviality, but once they knew that I had discovered the woman, they became incensed, and they're like, do not deal with this woman. And I knew this woman from previous dreams, from previous decades, and I knew not to provoke her or to proposition her sexually and that sort of thing. But what ensued was a cosmic war where she destroyed every god at that party. I woke up just utterly terrified and thinking, one of the first thoughts that came to me was, this was in some sense, a microcosm of Nietzsche's world where he had elided the feminine from his life. And it spoke to me perhaps in a way where I was doing the same. That was the interpretation that I landed on with a friend with whom I talked about the dream later. But it's interesting because there's a bit of, cosmic femininity and then this kind of utter destruction that ensues upon meeting this woman.
Yeah, there's a lot of rich connections between what you've just said and much of the unsaid yet part of mine. And one of the take home conclusions for me in the ensuing days after that experience was, oh my God, that's what they mean by myth. We toss around myths and mythology, and I just thought, God, Jung and even Freud and Hillman and people, it's so easy for the academic people and to talk about mythology, but if you are so lucky or unlucky to really experience the full force of whatever the hell that is, it takes you right outside of the human and puts it in a much larger context. And so that's what I was alluding to earlier, that my sense of what mundus imaginalis and the imagination means, it's in kind of flux now because it has to take the nature of whatever that was into account.
And so our academic personae need to have a bit of compassion for this other side of ourselves where so much gets lost in translation from time to time. But Tom, we've been talking for about 90 minutes. It's been wonderful having you. Before we close things out, is there anything that you're working on now or something that you'd like to plug?
Yeah, I'll plug the fact that I teach classes online. I mean, to call them classes is a bit of a stretch, but I do lectures and then with Q&As after them. And I've been doing it for 4 or 5 years now. And the topics vary, but they're always related to this kind of material. And I've got a Substack. And if you could stand listening to me for 90 minutes here, then perhaps you'd be interested in listening to me for 60 or so minutes in one of the classes. I try to keep them affordable and not too long. We typically meet twice a week for 90 minutes for about 4 weeks, and I do recordings so people who can't come live can listen to the recording. So the next one we're going to do, I mean, this one I will plug. I always post it on my Substack, which is easy to find. Just look me up. And the one we're going to do this time is the newest book by Emmanuel Cocha. Do you happen to know him? Coccia.
Oh, yeah, Emmanuel Cocha, of course, yeah.
Yeah, I love that guy, and he's published a new book which is absolutely perfect for me right now. It's called The Philosophy of Home, and it's quite short. We can definitely do it in 4 weeks, and it's gonna provide an opportunity to discuss. It may not sound like it, but what I am now seeing as central to everything that we just talked about in the last 90 minutes, which are the 3 topics of love, intimacy, and home. And so those will be our topics in a cosmological as well as a domestic sense. Coach is just a gas to read. He's amazing.
Yeah, I read the book on plants a few years ago, which was awesome.
Yeah, I think he's working at the level of the pre-Socratics. I mean, I absolutely love that book. We did it twice, I think, and then we also tackled the one he did afterwards, which is called Metamorphoses, and that is really challenging. I think he's one of the coolest philosophers working these days. I love his stuff.
He's somebody that we'll have to get on here. Well, Tom, I want to thank you, and maybe we'll have you back in the future to talk about, who knows, maybe your 4th installment in your Brazilian adventures. So,
yeah. Thanks a lot for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.